Very well. Good night to you all, and welcome to the first session in our cycle of conversation about the rivers north of the future. This book by Iván Illich ensued from a long-standing dialogue with David Cayley, whom I am honored to introduce tonight, and who called those words that Iván addressed to him and to us, his readers, Illich's testament. I am Juan Manuel Escamilla, editor at A Los Ventos Ediciones, an independent literary and scholarly publishing house that launched a Mexican translation of this book in 2019. Los ríos al norte del futuro, conversaciones con David Cayley. I am delighted to be with such a gathering of Iván's friends. It is a pleasure to see you all tonight. I want to thank the compas, Elias González and Héctor Peña, for making this possible. In A Los Ventos' name as well, I also want to acknowledge the support of Instituto 17, Amanecer, blog de Filosofía y Mística, and the Instituto de Filosofía. Allow me to say that we are enchanted to have David Cayley with us this evening. Good night to you, David.
Hello, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. While the rest of our conversations are meant to be held in Spanish, we'll continue to have this conversation in English in a modest but hospitable attempt to engage with like-minded people elsewhere. However, if most of you do not speak English at all, si la mayoría de ustedes no habla inglés en absoluto, por favor díganos en el chat, escríbanos y veremos de observar otra estrategia intentando ofrecer un pequeño resumen. So this is an attempt to join in the conversation with like-minded people elsewhere as well. So now I will introduce David, despite him lacking its went amongst us, for the sake of those who are and will be watching us. David Cayley is a Canadian writer and broadcaster. For the youngest of you, that's how they used to call people who made podcasts back then. Program On Ideas, which is available in the website and in YouTube, is deservedly well known. He has conducted interviews of provocative thinkers such as René Girard, the radical orthodoxy theologians, Karl Poliani, Charles Taylor, Iván Illich, amongst others. He is the preeminent biographer of Iván Illich as well, and he's consecrated 3 books to Illich, at least that I'm aware. Maybe there's a 4th that I'm not aware of yet. The first one is Part Moon, Part Traveling Salesman, or it comes from the program for the radio in CBC, Part Moon, Part Traveling Salesman, and was published as Conversations with Iván Illich. It was published by House of Nancy Press in '92. The present book, The Corruption of Christianity, it came from on a program called The Corruption of Christianity, Iván Illich on the Gospel, Church and Society. And then it became the book, The Rivers North of the Future, The Testament of Iván Illich, which was published as well by Nancy Press in 2004. And recently he has published a massive book on Iván Illich, An Intellectual Journey by Penn State University. You can readily find it. And before I address to you the first question, I cannot and I will not to recite the poem of Paul Celan that gives its name to this book. In the rivers north of the future, I cast out that net which you hesitantly wait with stone-written shadows. And finally, a parochial announcement. Amongst anarchists, I don't think that it will be necessary for me to intervene as a moderator. However, I invite you to engage in the conversation freely, but I will beg you to introduce yourselves before the first time you intervene and to be as brief as possible in your exposition or your question or your argument. Quienes no hablen inglés pueden hacer una pregunta en español y las traduciremos, sea de viva voz o de forma escrita. So since I'm here, I'll start by asking you, David, what mesmerizes you so much about Ivan, and why, in a related matter, do you call this Illich's testament?
That's two questions, I think.
It is. I was trying to get one for the price of two.
Fascinated, I think I would say that as a very young man, 1968, after I had lived for 2 years in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, as a volunteer with an organization called the Canadian University Service Overseas. So somewhat unwittingly part of what was then called international development. It was Illich's writing that made most sense to me. And I think probably from that moment on, I adopted him as a kind of maître à penser and read him faithfully. We met briefly in 1969 and 1970, but I continued as a reader until we became the later 80s when he came to Toronto for a conference. And at the end of the conversation that he allowed me to record with him, which you mentioned, which was broadcast in Canada under the title Part Moon, Part Traveling Salesman, also a title also taken from a poem he loved, as was the Ceylon title. He made a remark that was unexpected to me, even though I had read every word he had published before going to see him, and that was that he felt that the history of Western society, no less, that could be summed up in the old Latin adage, corruptio optimi pessima. So a proverb, the corruption of the best is the worst. You can find it in Aquinas, in Shakespeare, in antiquity. It's a well-known saying. He liked it in its Latin form, and I was astonished to hear that he felt that was the most apt summary of Western civilization in a few words. And I pressed him as we got to know each other subsequently to say more about that. By that time, he was old, he was ill, he was occupied in many ways with the people around him and with invitations to lecture and so on. He never did expand much on that theme beyond a few papers. So in the later 90s, 97, 98, I went to Cuernavaca and recorded his thoughts on the subject with his permission, obviously, with a view to making another radio series and possibly, although it was not at all agreed initially, develop it into a book. So that's what happened. We spent several weeks talking on 2 different occasions, and that did become a 5-hour radio series that you alluded to called The Corruption of Christianity. And then reluctantly at first, and then with more confidence, he blessed the idea that this should be published. There was reluctance. We can discuss that if you want, but he eventually came to see that it would be a good idea to publish this. And unhappily, before we ever could really get together and thoroughly revise the manuscript, he died at the end of 2002. The book wasn't published till early 2005. So it is more or less my edited version of transcripts of those conversations. I call it a testament because he himself throughout the conversations and in the book you've now published. And can I just be allowed an aside to thank you for finally getting the Mexican edition into print? It was a long path, I know, that's another story, but I'm grateful to you and your associates for doing it. And I think it's a beautiful book. So he stresses throughout that he is offering what he calls a hypothesis, a research agenda. He stresses again and again, he's confident and yet tentative that this is something to be explored, to be discussed, to be handed on. And it's for that, and I think he was sincere in that. He didn't think this was a finished idea. It was the beginning of major reflection in many, many areas. And so I called it a testament, thinking it was the gift he left, the bequest he made.
Very well. Entonces, me piden que si vamos traduciendo poco a poco. Me dice David en este momento que él llegó a conocer en su juventud a Iván y a lo largo de muchos años fueron teniendo conversaciones que terminaron viéndose cristalizadas en la publicación de esta obra un par de años tras su muerte. Héctor, ¿querrías lanzarte con el otro?
Bueno, sí. First, I will speak. I will say the question in Spanish, and then I'll say it in English. Un poco de algo que mencionó David ahorita como parte del proceso de la publicación del libro, que había cierta duda de parte de Iván de que apareciera como libro. No sé si David nos pudiera comentar algo más al respecto. David, you said something about Ivan's reluctance for a published book to appear. Could you delve more into that?
Yes, happily. A lot has happened in philosophy. It was beginning to happen before Ivan died, but I think it was very late in his life, and it has happened much more since. That philosophy and opened itself to theology in a surprising way. But he felt himself to be pretty much alone, I think, in what he was saying. He had not succeeded at all in finding any real echo or resonance in the Catholic milieu. So, and he was venturing, he felt, onto very tricky ground, questionable ground, right? So he dares, for example, at the beginning of the conversation, to mention the theme of Antichrist. Well, Antichrist is a figure once familiar in Christian tradition, but in the last, can we say, maybe 300 years, basically belonging to the radical and fundamentalist Protestantism, not a figure familiar in the milieu in which he had lived. And at the same time, the Catholic Church in the United States, just to stick to the United States, had become an object of scandal with the crisis in the American church over priests molesting young boys and girls, mostly boys. So there were a lot of people in Ivan's circle who counseled him against speaking freely on this subject. They felt the church to be embattled and misunderstood, and this was no time for him to be throwing fuel on the fire. And while I don't think he ever fully felt that himself, he obviously listened to the counsel of those around him. So if I can take a very colorful example, there's a point in this book at which he says to me, I can't go on without saying to you that if one thinks seriously about what has happened in the West as a consequence of the corruption of the gospel, it's one has to face the temptation of cursing the incarnation. I mean, I nearly fell out of my chair when he said that. And I must have spent a day editing, trying to think how to present this explosive statement without it being misunderstood, to have it be understood properly. And, you know, you're broadcasting on the radio, right? Somebody who's listening is driving a car, somebody else is washing the dishes, somebody else is running on a treadmill, they're paying half attention. Oh, I just heard Iván Illich on the radio cursing the incarnation. I didn't know. So I'm just saying he didn't say that, obviously. He said one could almost, or there is a temptation, he said, right? He was trying to dramatize how dreadful he thinks the place we've got to is. But it was a very explosive, potentially explosive, easily misunderstood statement. And that's why there was a lot of careful discussion. And finally, I think Iván began to see what, through the establishment of a study group in a neighboring town in Germany. He was teaching in Bremen. In Oldenburg, he learned that a group had been formed to discuss this text. And then what you see fully in Charles Taylor's preface, which I think is in the Mexican edition, is that he is actually thinking, I mean, Taylor's an interesting example because while the broadcasts were going on of the corruption of Christianity, Charles Taylor, whom I knew in another connection, called me and said, this is remarkable. What I'm hearing is exactly along the same lines that I've been thinking. So his endorsation of the text as a well-known philosopher, and actually also in good standing, or as by the beginning of this new millennium, Iván was kind of a man who had been very well known 30 years before. Taylor's endorsation was crucial, but it was just a straw in the wind, as we say. It was just a sign of huge interest in many, many quarters, an ability to understand what Iván was saying. But I think only at the very end did he see that might be the case. Before that, it was much more this reluctance, fear of being misunderstood, and therefore having acted unwisely, imprudently, carelessly in relation to the church that he loved. So,
si quieren hago un breve sinopsis de lo que dijo.
Lo transcribí, ahí va. La filosofía se ha abierto a la teología, pero entonces Iván estaba muy solo intentando encontrar interlocutores, y es un libro que habla sobre temas difíciles de discutir, como el anticristo, asociadas con un protestantismo radical que no era el medio en el que se moviera. La iglesia en Estados Unidos se volvió un objeto de escándalo por aquellos días, temas de pederastia y asociados. Varios le aconsejaron que no hablara sobre estas cosas, no era en opinión de varios de echarle, no era a la hora, en opinión de varios, de echarle fuego a la hoguera. Illich les prestaba algún oído. En algún punto dice que no puede continuar, por ejemplo, sin decir que si uno piensa seriamente en lo que ha ocurrido en Occidente como consecuencia de la corrupción del Evangelio, a uno le da la tentación de maldecir la encarnación. Dice Cayley que cuando escuchó aquello casi se cae de la silla. Pasó un día editando aquello para que no fuera malentendido, pero en el radio la gente no está prestando toda atención y de pronto oye algo que dice Illich, mira, Illich acaba de decir esta cosa. Y fue delicado, dijo, hay una tentación está usando un subterfugio retórico, pero es enunciado muy explosivo y fácilmente malinterpretado. Cuando Iván reunió, por ejemplo, un grupo para discutir esto, en fin, Taylor lo pone de ejemplo, Charles Taylor es un ejemplo interesante, mientras se transmitía en el radio le llamó y le dijo que le sorprendía hasta qué punto estaba de acuerdo, nada menos, estaba escribiendo un libro al respecto. Se refiere a Secular Age. Está en el prólogo. El apoyo de Taylor fue crucial. Creo que al final se dio cuenta de que podía ser el caso de que se pudiera publicar y que encontrara lectores, pero antes había tenido miedo de ser malentendido y de actuar de forma descuidada o que dañara a la iglesia. Elias, do you want to pose the next question or someone else?
Creo que lo abriría si alguien quisiera hacer una pregunta, o también Héctor, creo que por ahí tienes más cosas en el tintero.
Pues si me permite, bueno, Hernando, adelante.
Hernando, adelante.
Bueno, en castellano primero, para los amigos, yo soy de oficio traductor y por lo tanto tal vez le voy a hacer algunas preguntas en alguna medida relacionadas con la traducción de Iván Illich al castellano, a David, y digamos unas preguntas puntuales tal vez sobre dos capítulos que tiene el libro, uno sobre la contingencia, o creo que son dos, y el otro sobre la criminalización del pecado. Hi, David. I met David, I believe, last year or in 2020 when he wrote this article about the coronavirus pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah, do you remember that?
Yeah,
and
I do.
We got together with some friends, I believe some two guys who also translate, like myself, from English. And we finally translated your article, which appeared in some, I don't remember the name, thevoragine.com. You can find the Cayley's article about the first, David Cayley's article about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic in this blog or in this website. Of course, I had heard of him before, much before, because I've been following Ivan's works and books from when I was very young in the 80s and the 70s and 80s. So at one point, maybe I heard about David in some other article, some other conversation Ivan had with Mahid Zanema. Mahid Zanema talked with, they talked with Iván Illich, and 26 years after some other activity that they had together. So in one of the questions, Mahid told Ivan, as your friend Cayley says. So that was the first time I heard about David. And then afterwards, I found one chapter which was also included in the book. Cayley wrote Iván Illich in Conversation, and this chapter was the myth of education, the myth of the education, in which Ivan told us how he became this radical critic of the school system. So I found it interesting, and I then translated this chapter, and I shared it, of course, with my friends at that time. And also, more recently, I also shared it in the social media, in Facebook, I believe, even. And that was the second time. And of course, I was very interested when you guys got to publish the second book by David on the rivers north of the future. And in this book, of course, it's full of themes that interested Ivan and others. But I wanted to ask David about two things. One of the themes that, of course, is very difficult to understand, but also very important, is this thing about contingency. I would like David maybe to tell us a bit more about how he understood, how he read Ivan when he explained this thing about contingency, because we use it in ordinary language sometimes as equivalent or synonymous to random events like, you know, el azar, digamos, la casualidad, la suerte, maybe luck, but yes. And so this is one thing I would like to ask David. And the other is, of course, I'm impressed by this another chapter, which is David called it the criminalization of sin, I believe, about extracting from Ivan's talking about how, you know, the law in the Middle Ages, like the Christian law, became compulsive, obligatory to the peoples dominated by the church, and it became like the law of the land. So all the sin that before, just as Iván Illich told us, before sin was something that one made out of maybe not helping our neighbor, it became a crime. So that's the other thing I would like David to comment, maybe to further the argument of Ivan, please. Thank you.
Good. Well, I think it's possible to see these two themes, contingency and the criminalization of sin, within a single paradigm. So maybe I'll begin there, because the overall idea of the book is that the gospel is of a peculiar volatility. It isn't a religion per se. It's a disclosure, it's a revelation of the nature of God, but it isn't a religion as such. And when it is systematized, when it is made into a religion, when it is stepped down into a set of commandments, prescriptions, rules, it is betrayed in a unique way. So this is the meaning of corruptio optimi pessima, that this very best, just because of this volatility, I don't know any better word, I mean, like a gas that might explode, becomes the worst. And so when you come to contingency, which Ivan quoted the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg, that this is a unique Christian idea, right? That the creation ex nihilo, that the world owes everything to God. It depends at every instant on its God. It's for Ivan the most glorious, the most inspiring, the idea by which he tries to live, but it stretches the string, if you like, between God and humanity, between God and his creation. It stretches that very tight. It might break, it might snap. And he thinks that it does snap in the later Middle Ages. That's a long story involving nominalist philosophy and so on. But contingency by the time of Descartes has changed its meaning. It's become what you said. One sees the same thing with gratuity, that what is freely given becomes, in modern talk, what is gratuitous, which is unnecessary. So you see in the doctrine of contingency how easily it can be reversed, because to say that God holds the world in his hands, to say that everything is an implication of his being, his breath, it potentially draws all the life out of nature. It puts all the life in God, right? So it's as long as the life is there, but then it falls into human hands, and by the 17th century, a dead nature is being, a mechanistic nature is being contemplated. So the central idea in Illich always is that you can't understand modernity unless you understand what is being betrayed, corrupted, transformed in modernity. And the case is the same with the criminalization of sin, right? Sin for Ivan and for all early Christians is what a British theologian, James Allison, whom I like and who helped me to understand Ivan. Allison has a book called The Joy of Being Wrong. And it's a beautiful title. And so the knowledge of sin, which one has after the incarnation, so it's not the same as before, although the word may have existed, is the joy of being wrong, the feeling of forgiveness, right? That we constantly let each other down, but we also live in a horizon within which we can forgive each other and go on. And so this is a glorious, consoling, sweet knowledge. But when you come, he takes it to a certain point in history, but it happens more gradually. When you come to the reorganization of the church in the High Middle Ages and the elaboration of the canon law and the development of the role of the priest as a kind of magistrate who judges conscience, then sin in a way is codified as a criminal code. And so again, a glorious knowledge has been transformed into a uniquely repressive knowledge, a knowledge that, from the hand of the church reaches from the steeple, he says, picturing the church steeple, into the very inside of the believer, into the heart of the believer. So an ambition, what Foucault will later call a biopolitical ambition, is born there in Ivan's terms. So always you have this reversal, and always you have this idea, which for me is such a crucial idea, that you cannot really understand modernity unless you see its source. So to get out of what we're in, or at least to begin to take some distance from it, is always to go back and see how it happened in his terms. So that's a short answer to a complicated question.
We're not doing the translations anymore. I'm writing it down in the chat for everyone. Does anybody want to take the next question?
I think I can. Creo que yo. Marco, ¿querías preguntar algo?
Sí, me gusta. Quiero preguntar la conexión between gold and God. O sea, Dios y oro. ¿Por qué la palabra se parece mucho gold and God? Y entonces, ¿qué Iván Illich pensaba? What Iván Illich was thinking about money and the power of the monetary system? Because I'm reading, I not find any much things about this on Iván Illich writing. Gold and gold. The importance of the monetary system in this corruption of the Christianity, of the religion. Thanks.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what I'm being asked. I think Ivan thought a lot about economics. I'm not sure that
he's talking about the corruption of the church and its relationship with the gold, the wealth, and how it corrupts people.
Yeah, I'm not really seeing what Ivan had to say about that. So I can't really answer the question.
Yeah, I don't think that was something Ivan addressed. Elias?
Gracias, thank you. My question is around, I mean, you were talking about incarnation, and not just to talk about the rivers, I mean, this book, but also your latest book, Illich and Intellectual Journey, and also the articles that you wrote about COVID, the pandemic, etc. I would like to ask you about the other phase, the discarnation. I mean, like the opposite, particularly in these times. And I really like to hear more about, I mean, because in your first article in 2020, you talk about, I don't know if it was a conversation, but or just like an opposite idea between, for example, Donna Haraway and this idea of cyborg, and I mean this kind of narrative that in order to pass the crisis, we have to accept that we are hybrid and robots and stuff like that, and in the other hand, you say Illich is, I mean, will never be agree with that. So I would like to hear more about this idea of this incarnation, and also I mean, more about the possible dialogue between these two different narratives, the ones that is more in the field from, I mean, Dora Haraway, Timothy Morton, or these authors that are more thinking about celebrating, the celebration of our robot parts, and on the other hand, these Illich ideas of recover our humanity. So let me try to translate this question. Estoy preguntando un poquito sobre, no solamente eso en el libro de los ríos al norte del futuro, sino también en el último libro de Cayley sobre Illich, en sus artículos que escribió sobre el COVID. Él en algún momento en el primer artículo compara un poco las narrativas que pertenecen, por ejemplo, a nociones como las de Donna Haraway, de darnos cuenta pues, de esta hibridación, de lo híbrido, o Timothy Morton, que habla de cosas similares. Y él ahí contrapone un poco la noción de Iván, de la desencarnación y todo este asunto, ¿no? Entonces estoy preguntando como por esta comparación un poco. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me try and begin my answer with the parable of the Samaritan, which Illich uses as a paradigm of the entire New Testament in his later teaching and also in his conversations with me. And he says that this story has been generally misunderstood for a long time as telling you what you ought to do, not answering the question that Jesus was actually asked, who is my neighbor, but how ought I to behave to my neighbor? And his claim was that what it was saying was that there is absolutely no way of predicting who your neighbor might be. And because the Samaritan is the most unlikely of neighbors to the Judean in the ditch, being from the estranged and half enemy and northern people of Israel. So, and what happens between the Samaritan and the half dead man in the ditch is a movement in his guts. In the Old English of the King James Bible is called the bowels. It's a movement. It's a call. It's something direct. It's something personal, and it's something that cannot ever be seen from the outside. It's between these two. It's a personal relationship. So embodiment is everything. The incarnation is an embodiment, and it comes to us as an embodiment, and it's the possibility of extending it through our own embodiment, through our response to others. So that's step one. Step two, Illich at the end of the 60s, early 70s was enthusiastic about the new science of cybernetics. We can say in shorthand computers now. And you see the traces of it in the end of deschooling. You know, the possibility of linking people and computer networks and so on could eliminate a whole lot of top-down control and bureaucracy. By the early 80s, he's come to the conclusion that this way of thinking, the way of thinking of system, for a shorthand word, is disembodying in a crucial way. And he continues to develop that thought. So he says to me in The Rivers North of the Future that risk is the most important religiously celebrated ideology in our time. I mean, that's quite a statement, really. So he's claiming, first of all, that it's religious, but also that it's the most important. It's the crucial one. So what happens in risk, to put it very simply, is that, and I'm not talking about risk in ordinary language. I'm not talking about danger. I'm not talking about a prudent response to danger. I'm talking about risk as a mathematical construct. So the way people around me now know the risk of their getting COVID because someone has made a model in which the risk is supposedly demonstrated. So risk is a mathematical concept. It basically tells me what will happen to someone like me on average. So my risk is what will happen to someone like me on average. If I identify myself with that, I, in effect, project myself on a mathematical curve. I cease to be myself. I become that construct, who bears certain risks and who ought to act in view of risks. And so in a certain way, we are moved existentially into the future. We live in view of what might happen. And insofar as we live in view of what might happen, what is happening, what is there at hand, may elude us or may cease to have any importance. And I think that was what Iván thought had happened. There are terrifying apocalyptic statements in this book, in The Rivers North of the Future, including one, for example, that the scene of the Annunciation, the scene in which Mary is told that she's pregnant by the Holy Spirit, is very important to Iván. And he says, I think now at the end of my life that the kind of body in which this was a meaningful story, that Mary actually bore God within her, can't make any sense to anybody anymore. They don't have that kind of a body in which that could happen. So he was very serious about this. He really felt that after the 80s, a new phase of Western society began. It didn't begin at that moment. It had its precursors, obviously, but it became manifest, in which a kind of disembodiment had occurred. And I have the impression that I live amongst people who are, although as fleshy as I am, are yet in that other sense, strangely disembodied. That's my answer.
Yes, thank you, David. I have a question here from.
I didn't answer about Haraway, but you know, perfect. I mean, Haraway was a great philosopher of the immune system, right? As the paradigm of our time, and it's come true, right? For people around me here in Toronto, it may or may not be the same where you are. It's a certainty, to take one of Iván's words. It's a certainty that society is primarily an immune system. That's how we should conceive it. And once that becomes a certainty, then it's pretty obvious that if I don't get myself vaccinated, the state is fully entitled to come and vaccinate me, whether I wish it or not. Whatever I may personally feel or whatever intuition I may have about my own being, it doesn't matter. I am an element in an immune system, and the only relevant question is whether I act responsibly as such. So I think I'm only speaking now for Canada because I really don't know what's going on in Mexico, and I hope it's different. And even in England, where Juan Manuel is, they've behaved more sensibly than we have here. But I think it shows that what he said and what it may have been questionable when he said, it may have seemed questionable when he said it, has fully come true. Fully.
Thank you very much, David. Muchas gracias, David. I have a question from Mario. Let me read it to you. Tengo una pregunta de Mario, la escribió en el chat. It says, how can we reconcile Illich ideas about personal contact, generous and spontaneous, with the possibilities of political organization? My question is about the substantial difference between Illich and Hannah Arendt. Let me translate. La pregunta de Mario dice, ¿cómo podemos reconciliar las ideas de Illich acerca del contacto personal, como la generosidad y la espontaneidad, con las posibilidades de la organización política? Mi pregunta es sobre la diferencia sustancial que existe entre Illich y Hannah Arendt. Go ahead, David. Thank you.
Wow, that's quite a question, and deserves a better answer than I'm going to be able to give off the cuff. I did, on my website, which maybe somehow can be linked to this, there's a long reflection on Illich and Arendt, which didn't fit in the book that I just did called Intellectual Journey. So that might be a reference to look up if you want more than I can say. Illich is really is what he says he is, which is a proscriptive thinker. He basically is not offering a political program. He's offering a set of criteria by which one might be guided in laying out a political program. So I think and he's, in the sense of all he ever said about how this was to be achieved, he sounds like a pretty conventional liberal, that he hopes to assemble a majority behind the ideas that he's putting forward about the disestablishment about schools, about reining in the medical system, about creating limits to tools, creating a roof, as he says, of technological characteristics under which a society can be happy and limit itself. He never says how those things could be achieved. It's pretty clear, I think, that he gave friendship a very central role, in the sense that he always emphasized that in the ancient city, politics was a condition of friendship. Belonging to the polity was the ground on which friendship grew. In the Christian era, those relations were reversed, and friendship was the condition under which a different polity might eventually grow. So I think he was in earnest in thinking that that any new way of doing things would have to pass from hand to hand, as it were, would have to be grounded in a certain kind of political friendship. So there's a remarkable overlap with Hannah Arendt in his analysis, particularly on the theme of life. Now that's, and it's surprising in a certain way. I can't just say that. I have to say what I'm saying. So in the middle 80s, an American preacher came to Iván and said, I want you to give a lecture on life, because life is tearing the church apart. He meant life in the sense of abortion, nuclear disarmament, and so on. Ivan gave that lecture, which is not recorded, but later on, 1989, addressing a Lutheran convocation in Chicago, he did give a lecture on life in which he said that life was the greatest idol the church had to face in its history. A remarkable statement, barely understandable by his auditors and by subsequent readers, as far as I can tell, and still controversial in the middle of the pandemic when I don't think people understand him much. But it's interesting that he never referred his argument to Foucault, whose reflections on biopolitics he must certainly have known a little bit about. He never referred it to Arendt. In The Human Condition, all her talk. So I really don't know what his relationship to Arendt might have been, or whether he had one. So that's a bit of a garbled answer. I'm sorry. It's a very, very big subject.
Unless someone else kicks in, I do want to ask this question, even if I probably know your answer beforehand. So hear me out. So would you regard Ivan as a mystic? What do I mean by mystic? I have it that you don't agree with the view that Illich is a veiled theologian, sort of apophatic theologian, due to the pragmatism of his pamphlets that are not discussing with a veil issues on theology. However, the Christian mystical tradition has always been very practical and always has stressed the central role of liturgy, but liturgy not only as church going or attendance to mass, but in the wider sense in which Illich understood it as a celebration of life, to relate this question to the last. And it has to do with personal and political transformation, which incidentally is one of Ivan's long-standing interests, not only as a priest, but also as a friend who cared deeply about his friends, deeply enough as to try and persuade them with alternative ways of doing things that could be richer and more proportionate. And he was, after all, interested in several of the mystics whom he had studied, such as Thomas Aquinas or Albert, Magnus, and so on. So I see pragmatism as already a feature of mysticism, and quite a common one. I mean, mystics have been founders of all sorts of monasteries, communities, and so on and so on.
I would have no question in calling him a mystic, as long as one could qualify in a certain way, right? There's an emphasis in Illich from the very beginning on silence, right? The silence of God and the silence of the prayerful person before God. There's an emphasis always on the incommunicable. So even in his philosophy of mission, which was really the first thing that body of thought that he developed fully in the 50s and early 60s, it's always a question of the missionary's silence before another culture. And the idea that he or she can barely understand it, will be able to barely understand it. And so I think, and in the understanding of the, well, in the understanding of the Christian life, right? All the accent falls on celebration, right? On conviviality, to give it his other word. It's never doctrine, dogma is never disparaged. Its role is always acknowledged to keep myth at bay, he says at one point. But it's not the main thing. The main thing is celebration, right? Well, celebration is perhaps also a mystic idea. It's nothing communicable necessarily transpires there. It has a rational content. So I would say he is, yes, I would say he's a contemporary Christian mystic. But maybe I should qualify a little bit further in saying the reason you mentioned an argument I had, or alluded to, I think, an argument I had with a writer on Illich called Todd Harch, an historian who wrote a book on his years in Cuernavaca called The Prophet of Cuernavaca. And Harch sees Illich as a kind of almost as an ideologue, that he's constantly giving you veiled theology, right? And I just don't think that's right. So I don't know why I brought up Harch now. I've lost my thread. I'm sorry. An old man who loses his train of thought now and then.
I did allude to him because yeah, he's trying to make out of Ivan's entire oeuvre some sort of disguised theology, which isn't.
Yes. Okay. I recovered my thought. Good. Thank you. So Ivan, I think, is not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes or sugarcoat the sermon, right? He's not writing an allegory of the church in writing Deschooling Society in order to reform the church. He's seriously telling you what's wrong with mass compulsory schooling, and so with all other subjects that he took up. So he took very seriously, I believe, as a discipline, to speak without having to invoke any doctrine or dogma of his faith, with people who would not accept those ideas or would not think that they accepted them, and which might then be a barrier between him and others. He tried but this is also a practice of silence in a certain way, right? This is a practice of renunciation, of forbearance, right? Of trying by the discipline you impose on yourself to say this in a way that all can understand it, to see what the gospel is in this new missionary context, right? Which is his mission to the whatever they are. He hotly rejected the idea of post-Christians because he thinks they're all secret. They're all Christians that don't know they're Christians. So I don't know what to call them. But to the non-believers, to the people after religion, whom he very often found himself addressing, he took it on himself to find a way to speak to them without doctrinal presupposition. So that all somehow goes together, I think, Juan Manuel. Maybe you can hear a little bit of how I'm trying to pull it together. silence would be a key theme.
Yeah, silence is certainly the key thing, because mysticism is, after all, the cultivation of silence in contemplation. And it certainly involves, at least in Dionysus' account, purification of the heart, purification of the soul that will allow for the illumination of both goddess, beyond everything, and the beauty of creation, which we are sometimes in difficulty to appreciate because we're going too fast. But if we maybe.
May I say one more thing, which relates back to the theme of embodiment, which we talked about, which is the laying open of the human being by mathematical constructs, by scientific constructs like immunity and so on. Is there's a presumption to know each one fully. And it was certainly Ivan's faith that no one is ever known fully. And he insisted on that. I remember my book about him is not a biography because he said to me very early on in our friendship, there's to be no biography, right? I do not wish anyone to sit above me and look into my soul, because I don't believe it's possible. And I don't think any third can ever know what is between 1 and 2, not fully know it. So there is in our lives what he called a mysterious historicity. And we will only know at the end, when we die, what we perhaps we will then see what has been and know it, but we will never fully know it, even about ourselves at the time, and certainly no other will know it. So this isn't exactly what you would normally call mysticism, but there's a deep element of renunciation, restraint, silence, forbearance, a whole lot of negative qualities, which I think belong to the mystical path, probably. I think it's a rich idea to think about.
Fernando has a question.
David, let me go back to some themes that you touched upon earlier. You mentioned that one of the things that preoccupied Ivan very much was this risk as a religiously celebrated ideology, which became maybe much more clearer in later years, specifically in these times where we have been living through this pandemic, or this coronavirus spreading throughout the world. And the other thing is the perception of ourselves as immune systems, or maybe subsystems within a bigger and a global system, or maybe, it's we live in a age of systems, as is one of the chapters in the book. I remember that another text that Ivan wrote with his colleague and his German colleague, Silja Samersky, or something like that.
That's right.
about genetic counseling of pregnant women in Germany. And in that text, he already warned his readers to please not allow themselves to be, let's say, mesmerized or be engulfed in this world where one starts perceiving oneself as a as one subsystem that tries to avoid the risks that appear maybe in the analysis that the genetic counselor is giving to the mother who is becoming she is going to have a newborn. At that time, I tried to understand that text, and it seemed that Illich advised us to advise the would-be mothers to shake off that ideology, risk ideology, to liberate themselves or herself from this ideology, in order to welcome the hope that they were having about having a baby, another being in their family, and because the alternative was to maybe to say, yes, the risk of this baby that I'm going to have is that I don't know, maybe 60%, 50%, 20%, that he will he or she, my baby will have this Down syndrome, and it would seem that he was advising the women in this case to even accept that the possibility of having this baby with this I don't know, this incapacity, or I don't know how do you call it, but the important thing, it seemed at that time, that it was that one has to confront, or one has to address reality as it comes. And I asked myself at that time if he was asking people to be maybe a little bit like saints. I remember, like in the Middle Ages, or maybe in the times of early Christianity, there was this infectious disease, leprosy, right? And one has seen, or maybe you have seen pictures, movie pictures, telling these saints that get very close to these lepers, and with the obvious risk of getting infected themselves, to become lepers themselves. I asked myself if Ivan was asking to be a little bit like saints, or maybe the other alternative would be to become to be like fools. Like if something that, let's say one is near Chernobyl, and the thing is that they have this forbidden zone. You can't enter this zone without a proper mask or something. but maybe you are close to that zone and you have to save, you know, a dog or maybe a lamb that has crossed your way, and you have to save the animal at the risk of getting contaminated with radioactivity. You know, again, maybe he's asking us to be a little bit like saints, or maybe careless people that behave themselves like fools, or like, I don't know, stupid people. I would like you to say a little bit about this risk versus how you would behave, like, let's say, in a COVID situation.
Yeah.
You,
I think
you not only are risking to get infected, but they tell us you risk also to infect the others. You know, even you are asymptomatic maybe, but maybe you are a danger to the others.
Well, I think COVID is a difficult subject because it's highly manipulated. Let's just say it's highly manipulated, and therefore it's not necessarily reliable science that one is being guided by, because scientific dissent has been suppressed. There's an active censorship in Canada of alternative scientific views. So I'm not so confident about that, but let's take the genetic example, right? First thing I would want to make clear is that this Celia Samersky was studying genetic counseling, which is mandatory in Germany for pregnant women. It's not mandatory to do anything, but it's mandatory to be counseled as to the risks. And I think what impressed Iván in Celia's research was her finding that most women, when told there's a 30% chance of this or a 25% chance of that, assumed that a statement was being made about them as a common sense assumption, right? They took it as inevitably as being about them, right? So they didn't make the distinction. This is an average. This is something that has a certain tendency to happen to a certain class of people into which I have been projected. It doesn't say anything about me. It's therefore a different kind of knowledge than the knowledge I have of myself. So first of all, he's interested in the distinction, right? And in the fact that at a certain techno-scientific intensity, it seems almost impossible to keep that distinction alive amongst the people. They're going to be living in a kind of a superstitious haze of my genes and my risk and my this, right? So my genes, I mean, what the hell are my genes, right? A gene is a highly sophisticated scientific construct. But if I talk about my genes, I mean, there's these little things in there that, you know, get switched on, they're switched off, and so on. It's very hard not to not just naturalize it, but kind of common sensify it. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. So now, is he asking people to be saints or fools? Well, I think he believes that all Christians, including him, are fools by definition, right? The gospel preaches worldly folly. It's only through what he calls brutal earnestness that this can be made to seem like a sensible or workable program, right? Let the dead bury their dead. Who is my father and my mother? Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Huh? How am I going to keep them from finding out? Right? It's an astonishingly the call to live the kingdom now is pure folly. It's pure gratuity, whatever we say. So I think he certainly believed that. Did he believe that everyone would act that way or ought to act that way? I think he believed that they ought to know the difference between the expected one and the risk baby, if we can call it that. Mm-hmm. First, know the difference and know the status of that information, right? Obviously, for him, it would be a better world in a certain way if the world could just happen to us, right? Because the messianic event is always unexpected. He says that in The Rivers North of the Future, in this beautiful book that we're talking about. He says the incarnation is a surprise, remains a surprise, and could not exist as anything else. One of the statements of his that I never let go of. Is a surprise, remains a surprise, and could not exist as anything else. That's amazing. Could not exist as anything else. It's not necessary. Maybe Mary says no to the angel. What, then it doesn't happen? I mean, God's probably got a backup plan, right? But it puts a huge stress on this moment now. You and I, what is the meaning of this? What can happen here? What is happening here? What is present? You know, if you know that there's a 50% chance that you're carrying a baby with Down syndrome, the chances are excellent you're not going to be able to face that destiny. But I know a lot of people who are not saints and not even noticeably fools who just refuse it because it's not mandatory in Canada. So you don't have to have it. You don't have to know, right? There are still people who get pregnant and prepare themselves for the one that will come without having this knowledge, right? So I think he probably would have hoped that a lot of people would be willing to live without a knowledge which could only put them in the end, can only put you in the position of God, right? You will decide what occurs. We can stop this. This is not working as it should. We'll repair it. Well, what's the end point? What's the end point, right? His whole life, in a certain way, was devoted to this question: where to stop? What is enough? When do we start living and stop fixing? He's not denying that some fixing was good. He was always, you can't always tell it in the later work, but I think the earlier Illich, which was about a moderated, contained, a limited modernity, was perfectly in earnest. He was in earnest in Medical Nemesis when he praised a limited medical armamentarium, restricting the pharmacopoeia to, recognized beneficial agents. He was certainly in favor of cheap and available contraception. He wasn't a fundamentalist. He wasn't even anti-institutional or anti-technological, but there is a class of information look how the world was paralyzed by models that turned out to be completely fallacious. They were put out by Imperial College in London. Was there anything in history that we can find that did more damage than the models of the pandemic that were circulated from the Imperial College in London in March of 2020. They weren't right. They weren't even close, right? But so I think whether he's asking for sainthood or folly, he's asking to pose the question, what do we want to know? What do we want to leave to God? That's what I think he's doing. And I think the question is as alive now as it was then, only we're much, much farther down the road, and it appears as if only an alternate society, a community of conscious renunciation will be able to keep the other view alive in view of what I think the pandemic response says about the kind of societies we're living in, right? which are to be more or less totally controlled, right? You know, whether or not the paranoid ones are correct, that the vaccine passport will soon be the way you get your money too, or don't get your money. You know, I don't have to go down all those roads, but I can already see the outlines of a very different kind of society. So, thank you.
Gabriel Joly has raised his hand. Go ahead.
Though David partially just answered my question, I need to ask this question again. Good. Because I've posed this question before to other Illich experts, and that's because I never know what to make of Iván Illich. He's certainly thought-provoking, very interesting, but I never know whether to love or hate him. But the question is, what kind of critic of modernity is Iván Illich? Because Umberto Beck, in his little introduction book, yes, to Illich, says Iván Illich is not a fundamentalist. He's not a radical anti-modern. He actually is doing pretty much the same as Immanuel Kant was doing for the Enlightenment, to try to save Enlightenment from itself, from its worst excesses. And Illich is trying to do the same with modernity in a broader sense. He sees what the perils are, what the conditions of possibility of modernity are, what the fallacies are, but he doesn't want to throw away the baby with the bath of water. But then again, there are some other Illich experts who say, no, of course not. Illich is a radical anti-modern, and maybe some of his ideas to me resonate with other radical anti-moderns, whether it's the truly reactionary ones, Pius IX or John Paul II, or some, broadly speaking, postmodern philosophers who critique modernity to the point of actually destroying it, and I don't know where does Iván Illich comes between those, because I think one does not have to be a naive apostle of modernity like Steven Pinker to know that we live in a quite decent world compared to others, I mean, who really wants to live in a pre-industrial, pre-penicillin, pre-running water world, pre-internet? So, well, I don't know what to make of Iván Illich.
Okay, so let's take this figure of proscription and prescription, which Iván himself apparently said this to his pal John McKnight, who told it to me. I don't know if he ever wrote it, but he said, John, I'm not a prescriptive thinker. I'm a proscriptive thinker. I'm interested in what not to do. Well, if we take him seriously, that he's not a prescriptive thinker, he's not saying what to do. Now, his career as an intellectual involves a remarkable kind of chastity, if I can use that word, in that he spoke in limited terms on pretty carefully defined occasions on subjects that generally he was asked to address or felt called to address by some sense of social exigency, right? A sincere belief that the school system would bankrupt poor countries and stupefy rich countries, and they really ought to say something about it. I don't think he's a consistent thinker. I don't think he's interested in consistency. So Immanuel Kant clearly was. And so, although I like, in a whimsical way, I like Umberto Beck's example, I really think to call Iván to see Iván as trying to save modernity as Kant is trying to save enlightenment is pretty fanciful. It's a pleasing fancy, but I don't accept it. I think he really, in that sense, is not a modernist or an anti-modernist. He's a Christian, right? He wants to nakedly follow the naked Christ. And that's primarily, in his own opinion, and he's much more frank about it as he gets older, that's primarily folly. That is folly to the world. So I don't mean that he wasn't in earnest when he offered criticisms, but I think he gives I tried to say this at the end of my new book. I think he gives an example. He gives an example of a way that one might live, a way that one might think. And he's been an invaluable friend to me in that respect. I mean, and many others. But I don't. So I think in a way it's not fruitful to ask: is he a modernist? Is he an anti-modernist? Does he want to go back to the 12th century? How are we going to get back to the 12th century? Nobody has the power to go back to the 12th century, at least of all Iván Illich. He never imagined it or recommended it. All he recommended was that if you can imaginatively reach the 12th century, if you can somehow get there, you will come back to the present with a new understanding. So I think if he believed in the things he said he believed in friendship, in being guided by primarily a call, that he spent his life pursuing surprise. He said that again and again, that he sought surprises. Well, surprise is the opposite of expectation. it's the opposite of some of a foreseeable, of a design for the future. To hell with the future, he said. The future is a man-eating idol. Well, that's not much of a political philosophy. So I really, maybe this relates a little bit to Juan Manuel's idea of mysticism. Maybe see him a little bit more as a Zen master who hits you over the head at opportune moments, or kicks you in the shins, rather than somebody who's got a plan. Well, that's enough.
I recently heard you say, David, that Illich was such a traditionalist that he struck his generation as pretty avant-garde. When I can think about, say, some fathers of the church saying outrageous things, such as whomever dies tonight in my city, that's on me. If they're on the street and unattended, and the freeze will kill them, and we all let that happen, then that's on me and on whomever else is my neighbor, but on me particularly. So that sort of thinking is quite radical. It goes quite beyond regular Marxism, say. So when he comes, Illich, with the sort of ideas and as well outrageous claims, or the claims that seem outrageous, they also strike people as very avant-garde. Do you care to expound about this paradox of Illich's personality?
Well, from the very beginning, I see him as someone, maybe I'm looking in the mirror and seeing myself, but I see him as someone who thinks in opposites. So from the very beginning of his, don't know what to call it, his pursuit of a new church, that puts it as neutrally as I can. He often speaks about fear of a new church, and that the church is a giant that totters before it begins to fall, he says. So that he sees the church as the priesthood is a folkloric phantom, all these phrases that he makes. It's a very good phrase maker. And so obviously a new church has to emerge from this, what he sees as a collapsing wreckage. What
that,
he
for
said,
instance, comes
so
close
that, let's say he's say again.
That, for instance, comes close to the view on the future of the church held by Benedict XVI, who think that the church is going to shrink, but that's for the better. That kind of radicalism is near.
Yes. Well, his relationship to Benedict XVI is a whole other question. But let's say he was pursuing a new church then, right? And what he insisted on from the beginning was that tradition and innovation were an inseparable pair. One without the other could not succeed. They could only dance together. They could only make sense together. Only the most bold innovation and radical traditionalism were not only not contradictory, they were indispensable to one another, right? Now, I think you see that view throughout his life, right? His misunderstood book on gender basically says, amongst many other things, that there has to be an opposition for us to develop the faculty of imagination at all. If there is not something that we can't reach, right? This comes back then to the fully visualized, fully controlled, scientifically imagined world in which we know everything about the immune system and so on. So I see that always the dualities, the pairs, the opposites are there dancing, right? And this, it comes also to his mysticism, I think, right? I don't find this in Ivan. I found this passage in Nicholas of Cusa in his little book, The Vision of God, in which Cusa says that God appears to us inevitably as a complexio oppositorum, as a complex of opposites. That's what we see when we reach what he calls the wall of paradise. That's his metaphor. But going in and out through the wall are beings, angels. They voyage on, but they voyage on into God, but in darkness, in silence, right? That here in this world, the social world, the world of thought and language, always there are the opposites at play. You can only, and the opposite have to be held together, which is one way of understanding the cross, and the carrying of the cross. So, I don't know, am I answering it all? I think he's not making it up, that he's a radical traditionalist, that he wanted to heap ashes on his head when he mispronounced a sentence or sang a wrong note in church. But also he's the boldest experimenter and modernizer in many ways, right? When CDOC becomes changes its nature, right? It's no longer a Christian community, which it was for its first 5 years, let's say. And the adoration of the host, it was a very important part of their communal life, just drops it. Because now that's going to come between him and the others who have come, right? So he's traditional, and at the same time he's fearlessly untraditional. He's religious and he's utterly irreligious, right? He's modern and he's antique, and he insists that that's in a way the only way to be. That's the relationship he's trying to cultivate and encourage vis-a-vis history, right? That unless you can stand outside, unless you have or can stand outside your time, you can never really stand in your time as what it is, as just one time. So if I could just say one more thing in response to the previous questioner, whose name I haven't retained, I'm sorry. I think as far as political action, what is implied in Ivan's thought is, to put it very simply, one step at a time. And then you find out the next step after you take the first step, because you're in a new situation. It's what it means to live in the present. I don't think there can be a plan as a heuristic, right? In the same way that there can be dogma as a defense against myth in order to protect celebration. But celebration is the primary thing. And this step that you take, the plan is there heuristically, but you must react to the step before you take the next step. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of being. He believes it's the mandate of the gospel. But it doesn't amount to a political philosophy in the normal sense of that word.
So the barbarians, after all, are a solution, as Cavafis held. The otherness. Agamben has recently talked about Illich's time of readability. Time is right now for us to relate to Illich's work. What do you have in mind about this?
Well,
You read him now, that many of his let's call them prophecies, even if that's quite
yeah.
inaccurate.
Well, I mean, first of all, God bless Giorgio Agamben. I think
Sure.
one can. He's not to discuss his vast literary output, but he in a certain way almost begins where Ivan leaves off, right? We talked at the very beginning of our conversation here about what was the source of Ivan's reluctance to even lay out what he lays out as his research hypothesis in the Rivers North of the Future. Well, Agamben is probing into all sorts of recesses of Christian thought and practice as the seedbed of modernity. He takes that almost for granted. It's his primary project, and so he's very much taken up, insofar as we can say a torch has been thrown to him. Now, I think he discovered Illich long after he began this project. I think I've never discussed it with him, but so in saying what he says is said in an introduction to a new Italian edition of Gender. So it's a pretty optimistic statement given where discussion of gender is at, right? But I think the pandemic shows that Giorgio Agamben is right. That this and that essay of mine that Hernando mentioned, translating. I mean, I was astonished. It was a month into the pandemic, and I was very puzzled. And I sat down to do exactly what I said I did in that essay. I sat down to try and think this through with Ivan, right? And that essay, I was just astonished. It was partly because of Agamben, who published it on his website, Quod Libet, and since he's so well known, it became better known. But I just think it resonated. People just understood it, right? They could understand him suddenly because he sheds light on all this. This is exactly as he said it would be. So yes, I think his thought is legible now, in a new way.
So David, we are running out of time, but we have 3 more questions from people in Facebook that is watching us, and also here in the chat, and one more intervention. So if you agree, I would like to read you 2 of them and pass the microphone to Clara, and maybe you can comment the 3 of them. Are you okay with that?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So the first one says, are there any plans to publish Illich complete works besides the Neri Posa edition that is being done right now in Italian, in Italy? And the other question is, can you extend the explanation of silence and the power of anonymity, mystery of Nazareth, the Anonymous? And the third question is from Clara. Clara, adelante. Si quieres.
Yes. Hi. I have a question. In the prologue of your book, in the Mexican version, there's a part that says that Ivan used to pray always, but not in the way that we know is pray. If not, it refers to the acts of every day, like eating a good meal or anything else. So do you think he was making an invitation to live the present, like we say here and now, but in a conscious way, like something that connects us with God? I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah, okay.
For my English.
Yes,
that's
good. Thank you. So about the complete works first, I don't know of any plans of my book, Iván Illich, An Intellectual Journey, is the second in a series from the Penn State Press. The first was a collection of early writings of Ivan's called The Powerless Church. So I'm hoping, and the series editor, Sajay Samuel, is hoping that will carry on. I mean, we haven't even got Ivan's final essays published in English yet. I mean, they were ready. He told me they were ready to publish in the year that he died, and they haven't appeared. I won't go into the reasons, but so there's a lot yet to appear in English. We're working on it. That's all I can say. And I'm very happy about the Italian complete works, and it's a wonderful. It's thanks to Giorgio Agamben and also Fabio Milana, who's overseen the project. The question on silence, I don't think I fully understood it, and I've said a lot about that. So unless it can be clarified, I'll pass on to the third question about prayer. Ivan wrote a remarkable little essay, which is in English, and it's in that book I mentioned called The Powerless Church. It's called How Shall We Pass on Christianity? It was written 1971, 72. And he says that the church has always been constructed according to political models. So a Byzantine court, papal monarchy, and so on. They've always been state-like. The church has always imagined itself after state-like forms, I think you could say in general. So he's saying now that this giant is tottering and about to collapse, which he writes 50 years ago, from which you can draw your own conclusions. He says that one of the models by which one might construct the church is prayer. But then he goes on to make an extraordinarily expansive definition of prayer, which, as Clara said, includes eating and drinking and singing and various other things. So I found that very inspiring. I don't think he was in any way ruling out meditative, contemplative prayer or even petitionary prayer, but he was asking for a broad understanding of how we might live and do all sorts of things prayerfully. So I think in that way, he's conceiving prayer primarily as a refinement of attention. So I think that's all I need to say. And if the other question about silence can be clarified, I'm happy to take a kick at it, but I didn't understand.
Yeah, I mean, was a question from the Facebook, so the person is not right here. But as long as I understand, this person is very close to the little brothers from Charles de Foucault. So maybe something around that, you know, the anonymous spirituality of Jesus of Nazareth in the little brothers, how you see this present in Illich.
Well, Iván had a very fateful encounter with the little brothers when he went to North Africa and considered whether he had a vocation to stay with them, and left. And I think it was, he always wondered whether his decision to take up a political task, which put him in a position of great prominence for a certain period, it was misunderstood and resented in that milieu, that he was a bit of a glory hound, or that he had renounced that vocation to anonymity. So that's quite a complicated story in itself. So.
Thank you, David. I don't know, Hector, Juan, Manuel. I think, I mean, we just arrived to the 2 hours, so maybe some final reflections, thinkings.
Just one last question. To your knowledge, David, what has been the reception of this particular book throughout the world?
The intellectual journey? Or rivers.
Well, I'm referring to the rivers, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I couldn't. When Iván said it, I mentioned this before. When Iván confided what he did to me, not confided isn't the right word. When he dictated it. He shared it, he left it. I think he was primarily responding to me. Let people see how I speak to a friend, he said. This is what I think. I knocked, he opened. But I don't think he had any reason at that point to hope that the book would have the reception that it has had. I think that Charles Taylor's prologue was helpful because of the path Taylor was on and the amount of interest there was in that path, that he cited Illich as someone walking the same path was already important. But I think there were many, many young people, students and so on, who just responded to this, right? That this goes again with Agamben's theme of the hour of his legibility, that the hour of his legibility was already striking. It didn't just strike now, it was striking already at the beginning of this millennium. So the book has never stopped selling and never stopped being read and discussed. And your wonderful Mexican edition is just one more step in a long road and a long history. But yeah, I think he's there. He remains there, and will be there.
Well, thank you very much. We're out of time, but we have been delighted to have this chat with you. Thank you very much for your hospitality and your openness to our questions and comments. Thank you very much for being with us, everyone else. Either if you're watching us now in Facebook, or you'll find us later in YouTube, hopefully with the subtitles in Spanish. and soon enough in other languages as well. Why not? You can find this book in aliosventos.com. There's many options for you to get it, and keep coming to the following conversations that we'll hold throughout this year. There'll be very interesting participants coming, so we all invite you to continue attending, and thank you very much again, and see you all. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Buenas noches.